Dominic Carter was a billionaire with everything, except a heart that wouldn't be broken. When he fell for the stunning Juliette Kingsley, he thought he'd found true love. But she only loved his money, his fame, his fortune. And she was hiding a dark secret. Watch as betrayal, deception, and a shocking revenge unfold in a story you won't believe. If you love jaw-dropping billionaire drama, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. You don't want to miss what happens next. Dominic Carter's life was the epitome of perfection, or at least perfection in the eyes of the world. Towering skyscrapers bore his name, luxury cars lined his driveways, and his mansion sprawled across acres of manicured gardens, the kind that made ordinary people stop in awe. At 42, he had amassed a fortune that most could only dream of. Yet behind the glittering veneer of success, Dominic was a man who valued more than money. He valued loyalty, honesty, and love, the kind that could survive the trials of life, not the kind that was bought with champagne and diamonds. It was during one of the city's most extravagant charity galas that Dominic first saw Juliette Kingsley. She was the kind of woman who seemed sculpted to perfection, her beauty so striking that it left a room silent, if only for a moment. Dark, honey-blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face that could have been carved from marble, with piercing green eyes that seemed to look right through a person's soul. She wore a simple, yet impossibly elegant black dress that shimmered with every movement. She was not just beautiful, she was magnetic, commanding attention without ever seeming to try. Dominic, accustomed to wealth and beauty, felt an unusual tug when he saw her. He was no stranger to women seeking his fortune, but something about Juliette seemed different. Perhaps it was the way she laughed softly at jokes she hadn't heard, the subtle confidence in her posture, or the way her gaze lingered just long enough to stir curiosity. He found himself drawn to her, despite the careful caution he usually maintained. For her part, Juliette had always known her power. She had been raised in affluent circles, taught early that charm could open doors, and that beauty was a currency more valuable than gold. She had seen men like Dominic before, rich, influential, and desperate to believe in a woman's love. She smiled at him, letting her eyes meet his, and in that fleeting moment, she assessed him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that was both intimidating and alluring. And he was wealthy, very wealthy. Their first conversation was polite, measured, but electric. Dominic found himself genuinely entertained by her wit, her subtle teasing, and the way she could turn even mundane topics into something interesting. Juliette, in contrast, carefully studied him, noting the expensive watch on his wrist, the subtle branding of his suit, and the aura of control he exuded. She feigned admiration, peppering her words with light compliments that made Dominic's chest swell with pride. Over the next few weeks, their interactions became more frequent. Dominic invited her to dinner at exclusive restaurants, to private gallery exhibitions, and to charity events where the city's elite gathered. Juliette accepted these invitations with a gracious charm that masked her true intentions. She was careful, never asking for anything directly, letting Dominic's generosity flow naturally, all while planting seeds of trust and intimacy. Dominic, meanwhile, was falling deeper than he had expected. He was captivated by more than just her beauty. He admired her apparent intelligence, her laughter, her subtle way of making him feel alive in a world where most people only wanted his money. He began to imagine a life with her, not just a fling, but a true partnership. And with each gesture, her soft hand on his arm, her lingering smile across a crowded room, his infatuation grew. Juliette, however, was always calculating. She had no interest in love. She had an interest in comfort, luxury, and status. Dominic's attention was a tool, his fortune a resource to be used. She learned his favorite wines, remembered the brands of his clothing, subtly hinted at desires that only he could fulfill, all while keeping her own life meticulously compartmentalized. To Dominic, she was the woman of his dreams. To Juliette, he was a means to an end, a ticket to a lifestyle that she had always craved, but had never fully attained on her own. The tension between appearances and reality grew slowly. To everyone around them, Dominic and Juliette were the perfect couple, the kind that seemed straight out of a magazine. Their social media posts, their public appearances, even their private photographs exuded intimacy and affection. Friends marveled at how devoted Dominic was, how radiant Juliette looked, and how perfectly they seemed to fit together. Yet beneath the glittering surface, cracks were beginning to form. Cracks that neither Dominic nor Juliette acknowledged openly. Dominic's generosity became more pronounced. He bought her gifts without occasion, often thinking of little ways to make her feel cherished. A necklace with her initials, tickets to a show she had mentioned once, a surprise weekend getaway. Each gift was a declaration of love, each gesture a subtle test of her feelings. And each time Juliette received them with the perfect mix of gratitude and allure, her eyes sparkling as she whispered, "You shouldn't have, Dominic, but thank you." But the first real hint of trouble came not through words, but through her reactions when he was not looking. Dominic noticed the way she sometimes lingered on her phone, a smile appearing at messages he could not see. He chalked it up to chance, perhaps harmless flirtations, and pushed the thought aside. After all, how could someone like Juliette, who seemed so perfect, ever betray him? Yet, deep down, a whisper of unease began to form, a shadow at the edge of his otherwise blissful infatuation. Even as suspicion began to stir faintly in his mind, Dominic's heart refused to acknowledge it. Love, or at least the illusion of it, was intoxicating. He wanted to believe in Juliette's sincerity so badly that he ignored the subtle warning signs, the slight evasions when he asked about her past, the occasional glances she threw at other men in crowded rooms, the faint, almost imperceptible smirk when he discussed his wealth or success. Juliette, meanwhile, continued to play her role to perfection. She laughed at his jokes, leaned into his arms in public, whispered words that made him feel like the only man in the world. And all the while she kept her secret hidden, a shadow lurking just beneath her flawless exterior. She was careful not to overplay her hand, knowing that the moment Dominic suspected her true intentions, her comfortable world would collapse. Their relationship deepened over time. Dominic spoke of a future together, of shared ventures, of life intertwined in ways that seemed eternal. Juliette nodded, smiled, and occasionally whispered sentiments that sounded like love, but were always carefully measured, always just believable enough. For Dominic, the setup was complete. He was in love, vulnerable, and completely enthralled by a woman who, unbeknownst to him, was building her life around his fortune, not around him. And for Juliette, the plan was equally complete. A slow, calculated game where every smile, every word, every gesture was part of a strategy to extract everything she could from the man who loved her, blindly. Little did Dominic know that the moment of reckoning was approaching, the moment where Juliette's deception would no longer be hidden behind charm and beauty. And when that moment came, it would set the stage for a confrontation filled with shock, betrayal, and a revenge that only a billionaire with a broken heart could conceive. Dominic Carter had never believed in the idea of fate, but he could not deny that Juliette Kingsley had entered his life in a way that felt almost deliberate, like a carefully designed plan of the universe, or perhaps a test he hadn't asked for. After months together, the initial thrill of romance had settled into a comforting rhythm. He was in love, and in his heart, he believed Juliette loved him in return. Yet beneath the surface of lavish dinners, sparkling parties, and whispered endearments, cracks had begun to form. Dominic had noticed subtle inconsistencies, tiny moments that he initially brushed off as coincidence or misinterpretation. A delayed reply to his texts, an evasive glance when he mentioned a man's name she didn't like, a faint smile at her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. Each instance alone was insignificant. Together, however, they were the first sparks of unease. Juliette, for her part, remained flawless in public. She laughed at his jokes, leaned against him at charity galas, and whispered sweet words that melted Dominic's heart. She was careful, precise, never allowing her deceit to spill over into the moments that mattered. But in private, she was calculating, a chess player moving pieces with a steady hand. Every compliment she offered, every affectionate touch, was a tool designed to keep Dominic oblivious to her real motives. One evening, Dominic arranged a private dinner at his penthouse, overlooking the city skyline. He had ordered her favorite wine, had arranged fresh roses along the table, and had even hired a pianist to play her favorite piece.
Juliette arrived looking radiant in a deep red dress that clung perfectly to her figure, and Dominic felt that familiar rush of desire and admiration. "Dominic, this is
beautiful," she said, her voice soft, eyes shimmering with apparent appreciation. "You didn't have to go through all this for me." "I want to," he replied, taking her hand in his. "You deserve it," she smiled, letting him believe in her sincerity. And yet that night, as she laughed and sipped her wine, her phone buzzed on the table. She quickly silenced it and tucked it into her clutch. But Dominic, seated across from her, caught a glimpse of the message preview. "Can't wait to see you tonight." He froze for a moment, heart thudding, but before he could ask, she noticed his gaze. "Everything okay?" she asked, voice light, innocent. "Yeah, just distracted," he said, forcing a smile. He wanted to believe it was nothing, just a friend, nothing serious. But a seed of doubt had been planted. The next weeks were a careful balancing act. Juliette continued her dance of affection and subtle manipulation, knowing exactly how far she could push without triggering Dominic's suspicion. She mentioned other men casually, laughing at flirtations she had received, always testing boundaries. Sometimes she'd receive texts or calls she left unanswered until Dominic was present, then carefully hid the conversation. Dominic, meanwhile, found himself caught in a storm of emotions. He wanted to trust her completely, but the whispers of doubt in his mind refused to be silenced. He began observing her more closely, watching her habits, her expressions, the way she interacted with others. Each observation was a delicate dance. He didn't want to appear paranoid, yet he couldn't ignore the inconsistencies anymore. At a lavish rooftop party, Dominic noticed Juliette lingering near a man who was clearly interested in her. She laughed at his jokes, her hand brushing against his arm in a way that made Dominic's chest tighten. But when Dominic approached, Juliette turned to him with a radiant smile, saying, "I was just talking to an old friend." Her ease was infuriating, yet captivating. He wanted to confront her, to demand the truth, but something held him back. Perhaps it was his pride, or perhaps it was the lingering hope that she truly loved him. As days passed, the tension grew. Dominic's heart battled with his mind. Every act of affection from Juliette warmed him, yet every suspicious glance or secretive smile cooled it again. He began paying closer attention to the signs he had once ignored, the phone buzzing late at night, the subtle avoidance when he suggested private trips together, the way her eyes sparkled not at him, but at someone or something else. Meanwhile, Juliette's actions became increasingly bold. She accepted expensive gifts and trips without a hint of gratitude, using Dominic's generosity as if it were owed to her. She arranged private meetings with other men under the guise of work or friends, slipping away from Dominic's attention. Yet in public, she maintained the image of the devoted girlfriend, the perfect partner in the glittering world of the elite. Dominic's suspicions began to solidify the night he found an unopened envelope in her bag, a bank statement, showing large withdrawals at places he had never been. Charged to accounts he knew she didn't have access to. He felt a sharp pang in his chest, a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. He wanted to confront her immediately, but he restrained himself, knowing that acting hastily could ruin everything. He decided to observe, to gather proof, to understand the full extent of her deception before revealing his awareness. Juliette, ever cunning, sensed that something had changed in Dominic. He was quieter, more calculating, watching her more closely than before. She misread it at first as jealousy, a sign that he cared too much. But as she continued her manipulations, she noticed the slight tension in his gaze, the moments when he seemed distracted or distant. Her confidence wavered for the first time, not fear, but curiosity. One afternoon, Dominic invited Juliette for lunch at a small cafe in the city, a place where they could speak privately, away from cameras and the press. She arrived, radiant as always, wearing a casual chic outfit that made her look effortless. Dominic smiled politely, but his mind was elsewhere. As they sat, Dominic noticed her phone vibrate repeatedly. Juliette excused herself to check it, leaving the device face up on the table. For the first time, Dominic allowed himself a moment of scrutiny. He glimpsed the screen, messages from a man whose name he didn't recognize, filled with affectionate emojis and casual familiarity. His stomach churned. He looked up at Juliette, who returned, smiling innocently. "Sorry about that," she said. "Just a friend from work." Dominic forced a nod, his mind racing. He knew better. He had watched carefully, pieced together patterns, connected small details that he had once dismissed. The realization settled like a weight on his shoulders. Juliette had been deceiving him all along. She had been using him, manipulating him, and betraying him while he had given her everything. That night, Dominic lay awake in his mansion, the city lights glimmering through the expansive windows. He could still hear her laughter, the soft notes of charm she wielded effortlessly. But now, in his mind, it sounded hollow, empty. The love he had felt was real, but the person he had trusted was a master of lies. Dominic did not act rashly. He was not a man who allowed emotion to dictate action, especially not when strategy could accomplish what anger never could. He began planning carefully, observing Juliette with the same patience and precision that had built his empire. Every transaction, every meeting, every subtle smile she offered to another man was noted. He would not confront her, not yet. He would wait, and when the time came, his revenge would be as flawless as the life he had built. Meanwhile, Juliette continued in her oblivion, confident in her ability to manipulate, unaware that Dominic had begun playing a deeper game, one where every move she made was being watched, every secret catalogued. She was still the radiant, untouchable woman to the world, but to Dominic, she was a puzzle slowly revealing its edges. The tension between them reached new heights at a charity gala hosted at Dominic's mansion. Juliette arrived dressed in sapphire blue, a color that complemented her green eyes and golden hair. Guests admired her beauty, whispered about her elegance, and unknowingly watched her carefully. Dominic's eyes, however, followed every subtle interaction. Every moment she allowed herself to charm others. That evening, Dominic excused himself briefly, watching Juliette through the large windows of the mansion's terrace. She was laughing at something a young entrepreneur said, her hand lightly touching his arm. Dominic felt a pang of betrayal so sharp it burned, yet he remained calm, his mind cataloging everything. He knew the day was coming when the illusion would shatter, when the truth would be undeniable, and when Juliette would face the consequences of her choices. In the following days, Dominic continued his careful observation. He installed discreet security measures in places he suspected she frequented, traced unusual transactions, and documented interactions that would later serve as undeniable proof. He continued to shower her with affection in public, never revealing that he knew the depth of her deceit, keeping the mask of the devoted billionaire intact. Juliette, meanwhile, continued her games, unaware that the net was closing. She grew bolder, believing Dominic's love was unconditional, that his fortune was endless, and that her power over him was absolute. She could not see the storm gathering quietly behind his calm, measured exterior. A storm that would soon reshape the course of both their lives. Every stolen glance, every secretive message, every calculated smile on her part was being logged, analyzed and catalogued by Dominic. His love had not faded, but it had transformed into something colder, sharper, an intelligence-driven, patient force, ready to deliver a justice that she could neither anticipate nor escape. The morning air in the city was crisp, carrying the faint scent of coffee and autumn leaves. Dominic Carter, usually a man of decisive action, had arrived at the small, elegant cafe with the quiet intent of doing something he had not yet allowed himself. Observing Juliette Kingsley in the natural flow of her daily life, outside the gilded cages of his mansion and the artificial brilliance of gala events, he arrived early, choosing a secluded table with a clear view of the entrance, his posture calm, but his mind brimming with anticipation. Juliette was already there when he entered, a vision in a soft cream blouse and tailored skirt, her hair catching the sunlight as she laughed lightly at something her companion whispered. Dominic's chest tightened instantly. He recognized the man, a young, confident entrepreneur she had mentioned once in passing, someone she had never explicitly introduced him to. They were seated close, heads bent toward one another, lips brushing in laughter. And then, unmistakably, a kiss. For a fleeting second, Dominic felt a hot, searing pain strike through him, like molten iron running through his veins. Every muscle in his body tensed, and yet he did not move. He did not storm the cafe. He did not scream, confront, or reveal that he had seen everything. That would have been satisfying in the most superficial sense, but Dominic Carter was not superficial.
He had built empires on patience, precision, and calculated force.
He would not ruin this moment with an impulsive display. Instead, he observed, each motion catalogued, each nuance remembered. Juliette, completely unaware, leaned into the man, laughing, touching his arm, whispering in ways that had once belonged only to Dominic. She had believed her betrayal safe, hidden behind layers of charm and distraction. She did not know that the man she had toyed with so carelessly, the billionaire she had manipulated, adored and drained, was witnessing every act, every smile, every kiss in silent fury. Dominic's mind worked quickly, the storm of emotion tempered by the clarity of his strategy. Juliette had been with him for months, taking advantage of his wealth, his generosity, and his unwavering devotion. Every luxurious gift she accepted, every lavish trip, every moment of false affection had been carefully catalogued. He had gathered evidence quietly, efficiently, knowing the moment of reckoning would come. And now, it had. He rose from his chair slowly, his movements deliberate, calculated. He did not approach them, not yet. Instead, he walked to the far side of the cafe, leaning slightly against a column, letting his gaze linger. He allowed the initial rush of heartbreak to settle, transforming it into something sharper, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Focus. He watched as Juliette left the cafe, the man following, their laughter floating on the air. Dominic did not follow immediately. He waited, noting the time, noting the street they disappeared onto, every detail recorded. This was not about revenge born of anger. It was revenge born of precision, the kind that only a man with unlimited resources and an unwavering sense of justice could execute. Returning to his car, Dominic allowed himself the briefest moment of reflection. Juliette had been a master of deception, but even masters sometimes left openings, gaps that could be exploited. He would not expose her immediately. He would not confront her with the evidence of her betrayal until the plan he had crafted was complete. Over the next few days, Dominic acted with cold efficiency. He gradually withdrew the financial support Juliette had come to expect. The trips, the gifts, the spontaneous displays of wealth, slowly, methodically, they disappeared. Juliette, confident as ever in her assumed dominance over him, did not notice immediately. She assumed his restraint was temporary, a test of loyalty, perhaps even a moment of sensitivity on his part. But Dominic had already laid the groundwork. Cameras were installed in every corner of his property where she would enter or linger, each action observed, recorded, catalogued. He had legal teams preparing documents, contracts, and evidence for the eventual confrontation, ensuring that her actions would not just hurt her emotionally, but legally and socially. Every subtle act of betrayal, every attempt to manipulate him, was now being converted into irrefutable proof. When Juliette began to notice the withdrawal of his generosity, her confusion quickly turned into frustration. "Dominic," she said one evening, leaning into him at a private dinner, "why have you stopped? Did I do something wrong?" Dominic smiled, a cold, detached smile that did not reach his eyes. "No, Juliette, you've done nothing wrong, from your perspective." His words were gentle, almost affectionate, but underneath lay the sharp edge of control. Juliette frowned, sensing the shift, but unable to pinpoint its source. Days turned into weeks, and Juliette's frustration grew. She tried to manipulate him, tried to use her charm, her beauty, and her wit to regain her previous standing. But Dominic remained unshaken, maintaining the public appearance of devotion while privately orchestrating every step of her eventual downfall. He allowed her to continue her games, even escalating them, because each misstep only served to strengthen his position. The breaking point came when Juliette, in a fit of boldness, attempted to flirt with another man openly during a private gathering at his mansion. She laughed a little too loudly, touched his arm a little too freely, confident that Dominic would never suspect. But he did. He watched from across the room, his calm exterior betraying nothing of the storm within. That night, as Juliette retired to her room within his mansion, a room she assumed was her temporary kingdom, Dominic reviewed the evidence once more. The surveillance, the financial records, the messages, the encounters, all compiled meticulously. Each piece of proof told a story of deception, manipulation, and betrayal. And Dominic felt, for the first time since discovering the cafe scene, a sense of satisfaction. Not joy, not relief, but the cold certainty that justice would be served. He summoned Juliette the next evening, inviting her to dinner in his private study. The room was warm, lit by soft chandeliers and the glow of a roaring fireplace. He greeted her with his usual charm, masking the full depth of his knowledge. Juliette, sensing something different but unable to articulate it, smiled, a hint of arrogance in her eyes. "Dominic, you've been distant lately," she said, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. "Is everything okay?" "I've been reflecting," Dominic replied, his voice calm, measured. Reflecting on trust, loyalty, and the nature of relationships. He gestured for her to sit, his gaze piercing, unyielding. Juliette felt a flicker of unease, a momentary crack in her armor. Over the next hour, Dominic spoke in a gentle, almost conversational tone, asking questions that seemed innocuous but were in fact carefully designed to gauge her reactions. He watched every twitch, every hesitation, every micro-expression. Juliette responded with practiced ease, but Dominic noticed the small inconsistencies, the flicker of guilt in her eyes, the micro-shifts in posture that betrayed her confidence. Then, without warning, Dominic leaned back, eyes locking onto hers. "Juliette, do you know what true loyalty looks like?" His voice was soft, almost tender, yet the weight behind it was palpable. "It's not about appearances. It's not about charm, beauty, or wealth. It's about integrity." Juliette laughed nervously, assuming it was part of his usual philosophical musings. "Of course, Dominic. I know you value integrity more than anything." "Yes," he said, standing, moving closer, his presence dominating the room. "And yet some people seem to misunderstand its meaning. Some people believe they can manipulate, deceive, and betray, and still remain untouched." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching her carefully. Her smile faltered. Dominic gestured toward a large screen in the corner of the study. The room darkened, and images appeared. Security footage, photographs, messages, every indiscretion Juliette had thought hidden, laid bare in irrefutable clarity. Her eyes widened as she realized the depth of his knowledge, the precision of his preparation. "I suppose you think this is all evidence of mistrust," Dominic continued, his voice calm, almost soothing. "But in truth, it's proof. Proof that actions have consequences. Proof that deception has a price." Juliette's face paled. She opened her mouth, tried to speak, but no words came. Dominic approached, placing a hand gently on her shoulder, his touch disarming yet authoritative. "You believed you could play a game with someone who built empires on strategy and foresight. You were wrong." He paused, letting the moment stretch, savoring the emotional unraveling. "And now, Juliette, the world will see the truth. The law will see the truth, and you will face the consequences of your choices." Tears welled in her eyes, not for remorse, but for the realization that her power, her beauty, and her charm were meaningless against someone who had mastered patience, control, and calculation. Dominic's revenge was not born of rage. It was born of precision, intellect, and inevitability. Over the next hours, Dominic executed the final stages of his plan. Legal action, exposure of her manipulations, and the documentation of her deceit were all put into motion. By morning, Juliette Kingsley, the woman who had believed herself untouchable, was facing the weight of consequences she had never imagined. Dominic watched from his office, the city stretching below him, a mixture of sorrow and satisfaction settling over his heart. He had loved. He had been betrayed, and he had acted, not out of impulse, but with the measured justice that only a man of his caliber could execute. Juliette would spend years reflecting on her choices, confined by the law, stripped of the power and luxury she had so easily assumed were hers. And Dominic? He returned to his life, wiser, more guarded, but intact. The lessons were painful, the betrayal deep, but his empire remained and his integrity, once tested, had prevailed. Love, trust, and wealth, all had been tested, and Dominic Carter had emerged not broken, but stronger, ready for whatever challenges life could throw next. The world outside continued its unrelenting pace, oblivious to the storm that had passed in the lives of Dominic Carter and Juliette Kingsley. The city gleamed with the same shimmering lights, the same bustling energy, and yet, for those two, nothing would ever be the same. Juliette sat in the stark, cold confines of her prison cell, the walls stripped of luxury, the windows small and uninviting, the high heels and designer dresses, the sparkling parties, and the constant adoration of men were gone. She had been reduced to a life of monotony and reflection, a life where every thought returned to the choices she had made. The evidence Dominic had compiled and the subsequent legal proceedings had left her with no escape. She had attempted to charm her way out, to manipulate, to feign innocence, but in the face of truth, there was no power she could wield. At first, anger consumed her. She railed against Dominic, against the law, against the world that had seemingly turned against her. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, the anger softened, replaced by something colder: understanding. She realized, too late, that Dominic's revenge had never been born of cruelty. It had been born of precision, patience, and undeniable justice. He had allowed her to unravel herself, documenting every betrayal, every lie, every deceit, and then ensured the consequences were inescapable. In the quiet of her cell, Juliette often replayed the moments she had believed were her triumphs: the café kiss, the laughter at parties, the luxurious gifts she had taken for granted. Each memory, once a source of pride, now became a testament to her folly. The lessons were painfully clear. Beauty, charm, and deceit could never outweigh integrity, foresight, and strategy. Dominic had loved her sincerely, had trusted her completely, and she had squandered it all. Meanwhile, Dominic returned to the rhythm of his empire. He attended meetings, oversaw investments, and navigated high-profile deals with the same brilliance that had earned him his fortune. But beneath the veneer of business acumen and public appearances, a subtle shift had taken place. He was wiser now, his heart more guarded, his trust more measured. The experience with Juliette had taught him the painful truth about human nature. Even in a world of privilege and power, betrayal could come disguised in the most beautiful forms. Yet Dominic did not let bitterness consume him. He understood that vengeance, while necessary, was not the same as hatred. His actions had been calculated, precise, and just, and with Juliette's fall, he could move forward unburdened. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing that justice had been served, not only legally, but morally and emotionally. He had confronted betrayal not with impulsive anger, but with patience, intellect, and foresight. Over time, Dominic's focus shifted from the past to the future. He began investing more in philanthropic ventures, in causes that mattered to him deeply, using his resources to create positive change in the world. The experience with Juliette, painful as it had been, had refined his perspective on love, trust, and loyalty. He approached relationships more carefully, seeking authenticity over charm, depth over superficial beauty. From time to time, he would receive updates about Juliette, news from legal channels, whispers from mutual acquaintances, or brief glimpses of her life through monitored channels. Each update served as a quiet reminder of the consequences of deception. She remained bitter, frustrated, and trapped in the life her choices had earned. And yet Dominic never gloated. His satisfaction was quiet, contained within the knowledge that justice had been served, and that he had emerged intact, stronger, and wiser. He reflected often on what he had learned. Love was not merely about admiration or attraction. It was about trust, respect, and shared values. Wealth could not buy loyalty, nor could charm mask deceit indefinitely. And while heartbreak was a bitter companion, the ability to respond with intelligence, patience, and integrity transformed it into a lesson rather than a curse. Dominic's personal life began to flourish in new, unexpected ways. He cultivated friendships with people who valued him for more than his fortune, mentors and confidants who shared his vision and principles. He traveled for business and pleasure, enjoying the world with a clarity of mind that had once been clouded by infatuation. And though his heart had been tested, he remained open, careful, yes, but willing to embrace the possibility of genuine connection once more. In a quiet moment, Dominic sat in his study, overlooking the city that sparkled like 1,000 stars below him. The memories of Juliette Kingsley were not bitter, they were instructive. He remembered her charm, her beauty, her manipulations, but he also remembered the calm resolve with which he had orchestrated her downfall. In that balance, he found closure. He had loved, been betrayed, and risen above it, unbroken. Juliette, confined and isolated, faced the stark reality of a life she had crafted for herself. She had once believed herself untouchable, immune to consequences, but the walls around her now served as constant reminders of her miscalculations. Time passed slowly, and each day brought her closer to understanding the magnitude of her mistakes. The world she had coveted, the luxuries she had taken for granted, the love she had exploited, all were gone. And in their absence, she confronted the reality of a life governed not by charm or beauty, but by the consequences of her actions. For Dominic, life moved forward with renewed purpose.
His empire continued to thrive. His ventures expanded into new horizons, and his influence grew in ways that extended far beyond wealth alone.
He had transformed heartbreak into wisdom, betrayal into strategy, and loss into clarity. Love, though wounded, remained a guiding force, tempered by experience and insight. And so the story of Dominic Carter and Juliette Kingsley reached its inevitable conclusion. Betrayal had been met with calculated justice, deceit with unwavering foresight, and love with both vulnerability and strength. The billionaire had faced the ultimate test of character, not with anger, but with intelligence, not with impulse, but with patience, and not with cruelty, but with precision. Juliette would live with the consequences of her choices for the rest of her days. Dominic, meanwhile, would continue to navigate a world of wealth, power, and influence, armed not only with fortune, but with the clarity of one who had endured betrayal and emerged stronger, wiser, and unbreakable. In the end, justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and life, relentless, unforgiving, but fair, moved forward. And Dominic Carter, billionaire, strategist, and survivor, stood as proof that integrity, patience, and intellect could conquer even the most beautiful of deceivers.